Okay, so the basis of this talk, how to build a better apocalypse. There's a reason why so many games opt for post-apocalyptic settings, and this isn't just to do with macho survivalist fantasies, which is the kind of common assumption, particularly from outside games, that that's basically what we're all about. So this talk is about the more complex reason why we find that dovetailing, and how it's been optimized for, and what it can tell us about all aspects of game design. And at the center of that is an argument for the fusion between content and gameplay, which have always traditionally been quite separated, but in the last few years we've seen that more and more games starting to find traction with the idea that these things are very, very holistically intertwined, and understanding how those two things can focus and work very, very tightly together leads inevitably to better game design. Particularly in the last few years, we've seen games that have dealt with the idea of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic settings with a subtlety and a depth that previously hasn't really been there. And I want to talk about those games. I think they're worth examining in detail, looking at the specific tools and techniques they're using, what are the underlying principles that go on in there, with the particular focus on how they use this to bootstrap up immersion and emotional investment in the gaming experience to much higher levels. This doesn't just relate particularly to post-apocalyptic gaming, of course. We're talking primarily about action-adventure titles. And they rely very heavily on a common set of gameplay design tools and content design tools, which find a particularly kind of high watermark in these types of games. So although we've been talking very specifically about post-apocalyptic gaming, I think there are lessons we can pick up from this very kind of quite diverse group of games and apply back outwards to other types of game design that are all focused primarily on the idea of the player being in a world and having some kind of narrativized experience. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through a bunch of different steps, looking at specific tools as we go along, and then try and bring it all together at the end and make a case for why we can learn a lot from this. Okay, so let's talk about the end of the world. Actually, we're kind of not obsessed with the end of the world, because obviously if the world ends, there's no world to play your game in. When we're talking about post-apocalyptic fictions, we're talking about particularly the collapse of the known, but in a way that we continue to be immersed in it. So it's not as radical as something like Halo's kind of big space operatics, because the power of the fiction of any kind of post-apocalyptic scenario is based around the intimate local knowledge of the world which we currently live in. So fiction like Cormac McCarthy's The Road is powerful because we know the world that's ended. If we don't know the world that's ended, we don't have the same kind of emotional investment in it. So this is a critical part of the definition of what we mean when we're talking about post-apocalyptic fiction. Many games are very, very apocalyptic in their themes, but a smaller number are post-apocalyptic. I'll just quickly explain a bit more what I mean about that. It might sound a little bit like splitting hairs, but actually narrowing the field lets us focus on a smaller number of games, which means we can get to a level of depth faster rather than having to take in a huge number of kind of surface details. So, for example, Half-Life 2 is not a post-apocalyptic game. It's got an alien invasion and occupation. It's a science fiction, but particularly it doesn't focus on this idea of the world actually having ended. It's more about an occupied environment. Similarly, Resident Evil isn't post-apocalyptic because there's no inference of a global catastrophe, and the situation in Resident Evil is primarily about containment and resolution. Silent Hill's closer. You could argue that there is a kind of very personal apocalypse going on there, and that's quite a critical definition because that kind of ties very, very closely to the way that content and mechanics are fused in a lot of post-apocalyptic games. Is this focus down on the personal investment in a global situation. The other thing which is really kind of critical about that is that we are talking about this interplay between a kind of a catastrophe which is on a very, very, very large scale. And actually it's that playoff between the fact that the catastrophe is so large scale that it's impossible to deal with its magnitude, which again is unlike kind of more traditional science fiction like Mass Effect or Halo, where you can see the borders of the catastrophe in those games. In something that's more post-apocalyptic, it's much more about the innate kind of inability to grasp all aspects of what's going on at once that kind of is a cornerstone to how the fictions operate. Weirdly, the same goes for Braid. And actually, if you go on Wikipedia and search for post-apocalyptic games, one of the titles which comes back is Sonic the Hedgehog, which I think is fantastic. I don't really know quite how that happens, but yeah. The idea of fusing The Road and Sonic the Hedgehog to me is incredibly appealing. So this specifically human angle, this personal loss in the scenarios is really important. Gears of War, for all its bombast, attempts to bracket the large-scale events within the notion of individual catastrophe and loss, and that's hugely, hugely important. And that's something which many games have been trying to do, and we can really see that in maybe the last sort of 5 years particularly. This idea of saying, what's the personal investment? What's the personal involvement? How do we humanize this by looking at small acts? And we're going to look very specifically at those small acts as we go on. The point is that it radically changes the way in which long-term goals and conflict resolution are dealt with. Because we start moving away from this idea of resolving a kind of a very large-scale conflict or finding a large-scale solution to actually having a very small-scale resolution within a larger environment. And I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that as we go on. But I think the simple kind of basis from there is kind of saying, by definition, in a post-apocalyptic game, you cannot save the world because it's already ended. And that puts us in a very, very different position in terms of what it is the player's going to do and how they're going to feel about what they're going to do. The world's already been lost. The argument has already been underplayed. So this is our kind of like key points of definitions about what we're going to talk about. It's going to help us focus the games down. In a post-apocalyptic world, we are surrounded by traces of the lost world. This is critically important. We must be aware of what's been lost, or we don't have any emotional power. The loss is permanent. It can't be reclaimed. It doesn't matter what you do. It's gone. It's already happened. This is mostly manifested with a permanent and radical loss of life, society, comfort, hope, and basic means of survival. And when we start thinking about it in those terms, it starts becoming clear how this very neatly dovetails with the kind of gameplay tricks that we want to pull with players all the time, which is usually about taking something, a world which has apparent complexity, but representing it in such a way to the player that you can have a very, very simple structure of action and feedback. Life is not altered by this event, it's reduced by this event. This is not about society being built from the ashes. There is no ability to rebuild. It's gone already, and this is permanent. And there's a highly personal angle. Events are filtered through their effect on individuals. The individual is thrown right to the center of what is going on. And that's a fundamental aspect of it. There's no global actions anymore. So yeah, the defining distinction between post-apocalyptic gaming and other forms is pretty simple. In a post-apocalyptic game, the worst thing that can happen already has happened, and that's the world you enter into. There is no... The idea of localization is really, really important. We're talking about small actions, searches for humanity and meaning in the face of overwhelming global catastrophe. What's interesting about this is it's very, very hard to kind of reconcile that with the kind of macho survivalist fantasy angle, which apparently is what we all do, because if you're basically dead and you're just trying to eke out as much time as you can before you die, which is the inevitable end point, because the world's ending, there kind of aren't any heroics anymore. And if you're asking the player to undertake a situation where there are no heroics and there is no win state at the end of it, that changes, kind of flips the normal kind of understanding of game fictions on its head. So what's going on? Why is it something that is so inherently so bleak appealing to a large number of players? Because it is a bleak thing we're talking about. So rather than kind of going in also kind of like psychological, anthropological about this, I'm going to make another argument. And what I'm going to say is that the post-apocalyptic games are probably the best examples at the moment of where story and gameplay mechanics fuse tightly into a holistic whole. They're incredibly immersive and powerful, and it's because those two forms really come together, and it really exposes the sham that these are separate things and should be dealt with separately. And the power comes from that kind of that holism. So let's go into some details. What I'm going to do is just cover a few of the specific kind of things that we tend to find in these games and talk about how they're done and why they should be so powerful. But before we do that, I just need to say there's a couple of assumptions going on in what we do, which is the way I kind of understand all games, and it's probably worth doing that, because then if you don't agree with those, you can save yourself half an hour and leave thinking I'm talking garbage. So firstly, there's a contract between a player and designer that's central to managing the expectations of the player, specifically for looking at system shortfalls. So helping the player understand that a game can't deliver everything, and being happy with what it can't deliver, and not looking at the edges, not worrying about invisible walls and doors that, you know, can't be opened with a crowbar or a rocket launcher. It doesn't really matter what the details of this contract are, but they have to be consistent, persistent, and fair. And it doesn't matter whether it's Llamatron or Red Dead Redemption, that holds for everything. This contract can be broken, and that's usually where games break and usually where the experience falls down. That can happen by both game mechanics and game fiction. You can screw up either of those things and you'll wreck it for the player. But any entertainment experience of any form is at its best when this contract is created very quickly, is upheld for the duration of the experience, and every aspect of the experience is built to optimize the contract wherever it can. So fundamentally, that experiential contract is key. And for me, in terms of any form of game design or any form of game development, everything else is basically irrelevant apart from upholding that contract. There is nothing you should be doing in game design or game development, whether it's coding, AI, graphics, sound, whatever it's going to be, unless it's targeted on maintaining and helping that contract be as strong as it can. It doesn't really, it's kind of an irrelevance. which is not saying it's all irrelevant, it's just about sort of the target. So these are the design techniques we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about isolation, we're going to talk about reduced heroics, we're going to talk about the survival grind, simplified societies, invention and reward, ethical extremes, the beauty of the destroyed known, and the spiritual dimension, and we're going to try and get through those fairly quickly. So, isolation. Let's talk about isolation. In a lot of games, you spend a lot of time alone. Unless you're playing a multiplayer game, I'll put that on one side at the moment. What's interesting about a game like DayZ, though, is you are playing a multiplayer game where you spend most of your time alone. And what's really interesting about DayZ, particularly as it kind of matured and the lone player experience, if you were new to DayZ, became more and more and more difficult because murder squads started camping and taking over on the servers, which meant that the vast majority of new players never made it off the spawning beach because they'd get sniped. You kind of have this weird situation where you have a multiplayer game where actually the last thing you want to do is meet another player, which is a really fascinating situation to go in. I'm going to choose to play a multiplayer game where I really hope I don't meet anyone. To me, it's absolutely fantastic. Now that really ties in, the kind of whole kind of like zombie apocalypse ties in, because in a world like this, everyone's dead, no one's left. Isolation is a fundamental aspect of that fiction as well. So we have an immediate kind of way of dovetailing these two things together. This has significant advantages for tech. You need less AI, you need less rendering, you have less characters going on. It can be empty. Emptiness is something which is a lot cheaper than fullness. And that's good for us, obviously. It also has implications for design as well, because if you are actually reducing the number of encounters with other people in the space, it makes every single one of those encounters ramp up artificially in significance. And that's really, really important to us. And we can kind of look at that in terms of stuff like 2D design. In 2D design, emptiness is a massively powerful tool in manipulating significance. The reason why the Google homepage is so phenomenally brilliant is because there's hardly anything on it, because like at least 70% of the screen is white, which focuses your attention hugely on the objects that are there. So designing the space, designing the lack, designing the vacuum becomes a really, really powerful part of designing the thing. You design the background as much as the foreground. It's okay to represent an empty desert in a post-apocalyptic world because the lack is a feature, which means you can focus your attention. In design terms, it means that you can worry less about competing elements, of course, because you don't have as many competing elements because you simply have less elements. And you're supporting the fact that there is less stuff going on with the game fiction you're presenting. But it also means that the details become artificially ramped up in significance and meaning. For example, going back to DayZ, in DayZ, a can of beans means more than a radio aerial, which means we flip the kind of normal visual signals on its head. If something's big, it's less interesting to you. We're actually looking down for things that are very, very, very small, which changes the way the player conceptually navigates around the space. It means that they're looking for detail. If the details they're looking for are fairly mundane, they're not brightly colored, they're very small, it means the player has to look more closely, it means the player has to move more slowly, it means the player has to move more carefully. So every single environment becomes kind of weirdly richer because it becomes more important, because you're always looking for the small, hard-to-spot thing. The focus shifts to detail, it slows the player down, it alters the way that the player plays. The other thing that happens is that when you actually do see someone, then a much more complex kind of relationship goes on with them, because every other player in DayZ is a potential ally, or they're a potential threat, or they're a potential tool. So in a situation like this, you're looking at it and going, well, you've got the choice. You could save them, you could jump in and help them, you put yourself in danger, or if you shoot them, you could then shoot them, let the zombies eat them, and then go and nick their beans later. But if you do that, you've only got one gun against the next wave of zombies you come across, as opposed to two of you working together. And that's a really, really super interesting emotional position to put the player in, because you break down the normal kill or be killed reflex into something where you're not presenting clear-cut cases of what relationship you should have with other players. You also have the situation in something like DayZ where you know that if you fire a shot, you bring zombies to you. So actually, you end up in a weird situation where you end up sort of holed up in little corners watching other players die around you, not out of any kind of voyeuristic stuff, but because you kind of know if you help them, you'll die. Or if you help them, they might turn around and shoot you in the head the moment you've helped them because they're trying to steal your beans. It's a very interesting, very complex kind of thing going on there. There's a weird kind of correlation as well between DayZ and Journey and the way they handle multiplayer as well, although Journey's got a much more simple kind of, you're not having to go through that kind of complex stuff with it. But Journey's based around the fact that you feel an overwhelming emotional urge when you see another player. Because it's so empty, again, you artificially manipulate the significance of a single object through that isolation, which is an incredibly powerful thing. And First-person shooters particularly have always been driven by the idea of the lone survivor, the isolated avatar, but then normally what they've had to do is then just they throw stuff at you to keep you occupied. They assume that actually you need this kind of constant kind of Clockwork Orange feed of drip in your eyes. Whereas actually what's happening with games like DayZ Journey is they're kind of going, if you take all that stuff away, if you take all that stimulus away, then actually, the moment one thing happens, then it becomes as important as 50 things happening. And that's a kind of a tension which is really interesting to do. It's a really powerful emotional state to put the player in. Being alone is emotionally powerful. There's no two ways about it. And the emptiness manipulates significance. So you can use what's not there to alter the way the player reacts to what is there, as opposed to having to give them stuff, don't give them stuff, and they will start ascribing meaning to the things which are there. Loneliness is underexplored in games, but has proven potential. It's still something which we still can make a lot more of. It's definitely getting better. A post-apocalyptic scenario is kind of innately hardwires in these ideas of isolation and being alone. It's part of the fiction. It's very, very easy when you present that kind of fiction to say to the player, and you're not going to meet anyone for the next 3 hours. You don't have to justify why that would happen. The biggest point about it, though, is that it creates this idea of ambiguity and scope around individual encounters, that if you only have to present 5 characters, well, it's NPCs, in a 6-hour game, every single one of those characters is going to feel unique. You're not going to have this idea where you're grinding through kind of like multiple enemies. And it's not saying you have to have any more complex AI, for example, but because the player doesn't meet the same things happening again and again and again and again and again, they have less chance to understand the pattern that's going on in the game design. So actually it can be a really, really powerful tool for, without really doing any extra work, making each one of your encounters feel more unique. Okay, let's talk about reduced heroics. This is a much more kind of avatar-focused thing, really. If we've been in a situation where the kind of the world has been destroyed, then you don't actually have anything to save. You can't do anything big. The player is still going to undertake actions, of course, and we still want that to happen. But we're actually talking about changing the goals a little bit and saying, well, rather than actually having to represent kind of, you know, huge kind of global things going on, we understand that what the player wants to do is they want to feel like they have achieved. And that achievement doesn't have to be scaled to that kind of level. And the other thing which that achievement doesn't have to do is it doesn't have to scale according to the game. As the game progresses, the achievements don't have to get bigger and bigger. This is kind of a myth we operate around, that the goals have to get bigger, what the player achieves has to get bigger, and I'm not convinced that's the case at all. I don't think it has to happen that way at all. We can actually completely separate those two things out. Provided the player is able to emotionally invest in what they've done and feel like they have achieved, there's no reason, like in DayZ, you don't have to have a can of beans can be as significant as a kind of like an office complex. Exactly the same principle occurs to the kind of feedback of goal and resolution as well. We can make the player focus on the can of beans rather than the big red aerial. That's really useful because it means we don't have to scale up into that kind of 3/4 of the way through a game, the fiction collapses completely because it overscales itself. It demands drama in terms of mechanics and feedback. The world can't support that, the story can't support that, and it kind of collapses into being this big, huge, crazy thing. Games like I Am Alive or Stalker Call of Pripyat just don't bother with this stuff. They keep it small all the way through. And it's really powerful and it still works. And there's something to really learn from those games. Really the major goal in the sort of the post-apocalyptic scenario, if you go back to something like The Road, there's only really one thing that the characters in The Road try and do, and that's stay alive for another hour. And if you've kind of got that, it's going back in a way to kind of like old school survival horror in a way. But if all you're trying to do is stay alive, there is an inevitable, a sort of an innate reward in just the gameplay extending for another 10 minutes. And we can make more of that. The other thing is that if we actually reduce the heroics down to simple actions that we can identify with as human beings, we import into games, anyway, our social understandings, our understandings of physics and everything else. So, you know, games rely on this kind of schema all the time. We kind of know the difference between a car and a cardboard box, and we don't expect to pick up the car, but we understand to pick up the cardboard box. We import that knowledge into the game. Most of the actual goals that we do in games, when we actually undertaking kind of actions to resolve the conflicts, they move further and further and further away from what we actually know as people. We might just about have an abstract concept of pulling a trigger. Probably most people don't have a concrete concept of either pulling a trigger or killing someone. They almost certainly don't have any concept of killing hundreds of people, and they probably don't have any concept at all about kind of like crowbarring to death a huge alien baby. But there are things which they do understand, and something like I Am Alive, which is really, really interesting. I mean, I'm a parent. Anyone else who's a parent knows looking after a child is an incredibly powerful thing, and we can identify with that. And even if we don't have kids, we have parents, and we remember being children, and we know what that means. A hugely, hugely powerful, recognizable, identifiable thing to do. That's not downplaying fantasy, But it's kind of saying that if you really want to get into a deep emotional connection with a player, asking them to do something which they know and understand emotionally is a really, really powerful tool. So localized heroics, the small acts of kindness and drama and heroics that we do every day, that you see kind of like constantly around you, are really, really, really powerful tools. They might be mundane actions, but that doesn't make them boring if the situation is extreme. If the situation is extreme, like a post-apocalyptic world, doing something very, very simple, like managing to open a can of beans, can be hugely powerful. So we shouldn't ignore the small. The small can be, yeah, really kind of like give you a lot. And it's logical, really, because if you are talking about this idea of changing the player's focus from the big to the small, then it also means that the steps which it takes to achieve that can kind of be shrunk down in scale as well. So something which should be really obvious and easy, like opening a can of beans, can be something which takes hours of gameplay because you have to find a can opener, and the can opener is in a locked cupboard, and you have to find the key. And this kind of stuff which feels very sort of like churny and grindy when you're sort of saying, yes, I've got to find the key card to open the key to press the button, and that magically will turn off the force field, which allows the spaceship to escape. It's really kind of grindy, mundane in gameplay. But if you're placing it in this kind of context where you're saying, yeah, but you don't have a can opener, and you're going to starve to death in 45 minutes, then actually trying to get through a locked door ceases to become grindy, and it becomes a really big target, even though actually what's required to represent that target is not huge. The actual development cost of representing that target is not massive, because we're manipulating the player's significance focus as opposed to having to do that within the system. So in I Am Alive, like any other game like this, you don't actually do anything different in mechanical terms. You do with every other game. You pick up an object and move it somewhere else. You find an object to do something to another object. You have a child on your back, it changes the graphics, and you move from one place to another. It's kind of capture the flag and bomb runs, again and again and again and again. But you're using the fiction to manipulate the player's understanding of those mechanics, which is, you know, an old trick, but it's amazing how it still isn't getting the same kind of traction that it probably ought to. But these are small acts. There's a point in I Am Alive where you go hunting for someone's inhaler. And when you find the inhaler, you give them the inhaler. And you feel like a king at that moment. And all you've done is I've picked up an object from somewhere, I've found a key card, and I've opened a door. But you understand it, because it's something which is meaningful on a human level. Equally, in Call of Pripyat, the goal of Call of Pripyat is to find out why some army helicopters have crashed, and at the end of it, you find the troops that have crashed, and you figured out how to actually get them out of the zone, and you get them out of the zone. And it's great, because the game ends, and you kind of go, big, big climax, and then they go, what should we do now? Should we go home? Yeah, let's go home. And they get on the helicopter, and they go home. And when I first played it, I remember sitting there and thinking, you can't do that. That's not a climax. That's not a resolution. But it's kind of brilliant as well, because the more you think about it, the more you think, yeah, they didn't have to save the world. They just wanted to go home to their families, like most of us want to do at the end of a day. And if we were put in a situation where we couldn't do that, that would be like the world had ended for us. The other great thing about that was really, really clever is it means they don't have to change the world. So in terms of sequels, they didn't get into a situation where, you know, if you're producing a game and you have to build to a massive dramatic climax, that means you have to throw everything that's good about your world at that climax. Because we've all played games where you go, oh, you're holding back for the sequel. And usually those payoffs then tend to be pretty crappy. But also, then developers get themselves in another situation. If they throw everything at it, and I'm thinking like Bioshock 2, you leave no other good story to tell about Rapture because you've thrown it all at the first one. And then you're in a big problem if you want to then roll it out into the sequel. Call of Pripyat, they left the zone utterly unchanged at the end of the game, which is really powerful if you then want to roll that IP forwards. The IP is just sitting there because they changed it from having to resolve the zone to having to resolve the personal situation within the zone. And there's a real lesson in there about managing sequels. And we know it works outside post-apocalyptic games as well. Heavy Rain is brilliant when it's doing small acts, and is, for me, less brilliant when it's trying to do big stuff. Playing with your child in a garden is universal. Losing your child is a universal fear. Needing your inhaler is universal. Universal is powerful. And I think the other final point on that is represent the interior. So try and get into the character's head, the character's heart, those kind of states. That's what really matters. That's what people are really engaging with. And that's what gives us that emotional connection to the game. It's that kind of sense of identification. So it's easier to identify with someone who basically is like us than someone who isn't. Okay, let's kind of accelerate a little bit now. Talk about that idea from that last section, staying alive and expanding it. So if you start from a position with the player where you say, right, you're dead, how long can you last? That's how arcade games work, yeah? As the basic principle of most arcade games is you will die at some point and you have to extend your life until the point where you die. We don't tend to apply that very much into kind of narrativized games, action-adventure games, but actually it's a really interesting thing to do as well. Survival horror is all about that kind of resource management and kind of trying to make players feel like you are dead unless you do something about it, as opposed to you are becoming more powerful and you're resolving this big outer conflict, is a really kind of, again, interesting emotional state to get the player into. Thomas Grip of Frictional Games has spoken a lot about this in Dark Descent, about how the idea behind it is how do you make the player feel like they're going to die all the time without ever actually killing them? And interestingly, John Romero said a very, very similar thing. That was kind of the design principle behind Doom. How do you constantly make the player feel like they're utterly screwed without ever actually making them have to reload the game? You want to take them up to that emotional edge and just sit them and hold them there. And that's really the target we're going for. These kind of games, this kind of fiction really works well with that. Because, of course, there's another kind of natural dovetailing that goes on, which says, you know, the world has ended, you're basically doomed. That's it, you're going to starve to death, you're going to have radiation poisoning. All you can do is extend as far as you can. It means that you're pushing the player naturally in terms of the fiction to that edge anyway. And you're justifying those kind of actions, those kind of activities. Metro 2033 is really interesting for this. So in Metro 2033, you've got a thing called Ranger Mode, which makes the game much more extreme, but it doesn't just make it more difficult. It changes the way in which the objects and mechanics work. So in Ranger Mode, you massively boost the damage and massively reduce the amount of ammo available in the environment. So every single bullet becomes much more significant. I Am Alive does this as well. You usually only have one piton and one bullet in I Am Alive, and you're bluffing half the time. So that kind of grinding for survival ceases to be then about the accumulation of large numbers of objects, which is really, really powerful in terms of things like managing inventories, but also in terms of meaning that you can keep the player's actions relatively kind of ramped down. If you give the player a rocket launcher, what they can expect to do in the world changes. If you give the player sort of like 400 bullets, then they're going to act like they've got 400 bullets. If you give the player one bullet, they're going to behave in a very, very different way. And you can kind of manipulate the significance of what's going on that way. The librarians in Metro 2033 are a really, really good example of this. They're just bullet sponges. I didn't even realize you could kill them until the third time I played the game. You just empty round after round after round after round after round of ammunition into these things, and eventually you give up and run away. But the point is you leave that encounter, that firefight, worse than when you started it. And you don't feel good about having killed a librarian if you manage to kill one. You feel bad, which is completely unlike something like a Big Daddy, where a Big Daddy has a massive visual payoff. If you kill a Big Daddy in Bioshock, you're rewarded for it. If you kill a librarian in Metro 2033, actually probably you've done something stupid because you've got less bullets to go on with and you should just have run away. So this idea of kind of changing it from I have to accumulate as much ammunition as I can, so then my ammunition will get bigger, my guns will get bigger, the enemies will get bigger, the visuals get bigger, everything gets bigger all the way, all the way, all the way, all the way. And again, you kind of end up at this point where you tip over the edge. Where if you have something where actually you're saying, well, no, you're going to have 3 bullets in this entire game. That's it. And there's going to be 1 enemy in this entire game. It's just as emotionally powerful. It's just as significant. There's no heroics. It's just this desperate conservation of resources. And trying to encourage the player to move away from traditional kind of like ways of engaging with doing stuff and actually changing the way in which they view the world and they kind of like react to what's being presented in the world. And again, although it's really tough kind of design thing to pull off, it feels like the payoff is really, really worth it, and we're not kind of exploring that payoff enough. One of the other things which can go on, particularly in something like Ranger Mode in Metro, is that you can finish a firefight and kind of look down and know that you're dead. And actually, there's no way you can make it to the next station. You might have like a handful of ball bearings. And even though you kind of know in your head somewhere that the game probably won't let that happen, that it will do something to save you, that moment of thinking, I'm fucked, is really, really, really powerful, and games don't do it enough. Because you engage at a really, really tight level, and that kind of engagement is what everything is. And like, when you get to a point in something like Metro where you find like a ball bearing on a corpse, 1 ball bearing, and you're like, it's Christmas, I found a ball bearing. It's one thing, incredibly powerful. And it's just key cards, that's all it is. Rather than actually thinking of things like ammo as ammo, we're thinking of stuff like ammo as key cards. These become individual resources. The number of them is so reduced that rather than just grinding through this accumulation of stuff, each thing becomes more significant. And that seems to make sense in terms of design and development, because we don't want to just be throwing assets at something because they cost money. We want each asset to mean something, so why not ramp up that significance of every single individual item, make it feel unique, make it feel meaningful. Drive items by functional significance. Make sure they actually have a meaning in the world. Because again, if the world is empty and the world is ruined, then that one thing, it's about the emotional significance that a player attaches to an object. is much more important than this kind of just accumulation of stuff. Desperate players are engaged players. If a player is desperate, they will focus in what's going on. If you give them loads of stuff and you're really nice to them, they'll just get into that. The kind of halo drool, which I do quite a lot. And you don't have to play nice. Players can take you being a bastard, so be a bastard. They like it. Okay. At the end of the world, things will be simpler. We want to talk about the politics of survivalism. So survivalists withdraw from society and they stockpile weapons and beans and this kind of stuff, primarily because they think society is too complicated and it's full of liberals and philosophers and nasty people like that. And things should be simple, where you just shoot and eat and fuck, and basically that's it. The nice thing about a post-apocalyptic society is that that kind of stuff is a lot easier to represent in AI than complex social interaction, right? Which we all kind of know. It's a real tough thing, complex social interaction. So if basically all you have to do is basically accumulate enough bullets to kill people to survive, that's a lot easier to represent. It also means that it's very easy to represent in terms of game fictions. It means you can keep things really, really simple, and you've got a great justification for why you should do that. Rage is great. I mean, Rage is fantastic because it's like, you know, meteorite smashes into the Earth, destroys everything, but before then it was really technologically advanced. So we have all the technology, but we don't know how to use it anymore. It means you've got this great way of kind of playing with stuff where you can have anything you want in that world, but yet you can have no society capable of understanding it scientifically. So you don't have to do any of the complex stuff, but you get all the cool stuff, which is a really smart designed fiction to work with. It breaks down into tribes and alliances and gangs. You don't have to have kind of complex politics or negotiations. You just have to have kill or be killed. It's Death Race 2000. It's Mad Max. It's kind of easy to grasp. We know it. We recognize it from other places. Fallout is kind of more subtle and complex than Rage, but basically it's not actually that much more subtle or complex. It's still the same basic principle. If you strip society back and present a much more simplified society which has much more minimal channels of input and output socially, and again, you focus everything down. You don't have to produce as much, but you focus the player's attention on significance where you want. And I mean, you know, Fallout is still a place that's full of extremists and political tribes and stuff like that. And what's really clever about Fallout is they fake social complexity really easily. They have stuff like in Fallout 3, you have the kind of like the ghouls and racist humans kind of subplot where, you know, the ghouls are the enemies, and then you find out that actually the people that live in the nice posh tower are the bad people, and you help the ghouls, and you're just going backs and forwards. It's just, you know, it's just deathmatch. But because the fiction supports the deathmatch, you can buy into it. It lets you engage with it in a very, very easy way. It kind of hands you those kind of hands you all the cards and lets you kind of play with it, which is basically Halo 2 with more text boxes. But the fiction fakes the complexity. And because you can engage with the fiction, because you have that association, you take on something that is inherently quite simple and you make it complex in your mind and your emotional reaction to it. And mutants, obviously. Mutants and zombies are wonderful for AI because mutants and zombies are stupid and just do what you want them to do. You don't have to have them having any kind of like social interaction particularly, but you do create an opposing force for human society. You create a sort of a threat there without having to do anything. And we can put this really simply by just looking at these two slides. And, you know, it's as simple as that, really. Metro takes it further. Metro doesn't even try and represent all of society, but it actually gives you these snapshots, these incredible vignettes of life after the end of the world, which are all the more powerful because you spend so much of the game alone, and then you're surrounded by people crammed into these really, really small situations. But actually, all that you're hearing when you're in the stations in Metro are tiny little actions. Someone can't get medicine. Someone's grandfather's ill. Someone's pig has shat in someone else's tent, and they're upset about it. It's very, very, very small, very simple things that, again, we humanly identify with to a really, really high extent. And that's why it's powerful. You have these people huddling together in the darkness. The other really important thing about Metro, which goes back to the book which it's based on, is that the people in the stations are terrified of what's outside the station. Stations light, tunnels dark, tunnels empty, stations full. They can't tell you anything about the world. They have no understanding about the world either. So you put the player in a situation where there is no Cortana figure. There is no God who knows what's going on. And that, again, changes the relationship that the player has because there is no one to help them through. There's no one to say, this is if you do this and this and this and this, then this is what will happen, which is a traditional NPC role in games. You always have the God NPC, who's usually not visually represented. Cortana's the kind of classic example who goes, and now if you go and do this, this will happen. And you go, woo, and you go and do it, and then something else happens. Removing that figure and saying no one in this world can tell you anything more than you know means that we create ambiguity in the world, and it means we can start doing stuff as designers and saying, well, we can pretty much do whatever we want in the tunnels outside those stations because nobody knows what goes on in there anyway. These are just vignettes of kind of frightened huddles, and you know, that really helps us with that player-designer contract, because it means we can kind of, we can do what we want. And really, we want to do what we want in a way that the player is going to accept. But getting rid of complex representations is always a good thing, and kind of simplified societies help us do that. But the known world is retained. We still understand it, we still identify with it, because it's people that we kind of know undertaking actions that we recognize. Okay. Very, very simply, players love tinkering. This is kind of like the oldest truism in the book in game development. If you give players a bunch of stuff and let them tinker, they're usually happy. We like grinding, we like putting stuff together. Turning junk into gold is a really, really, really powerful thing. Fallout is brilliant at the turning junk into gold. It turns junk into ammunition and everything else. You kind of have this sense of everything that you look at is a potential currency which you can use. And again, that's a really kind of powerful thing, because what you're doing is you're taking really boring, mundane, known objects that you would normally scatter like detritus around your game world to just give it depth. And you're increasing the significance of those things and making those things individually actually feel like they have a really powerful meaning. So appealing to that kind of repurposed tech, that collector kind of sensibility in the gamer is a really, really important thing. Okay, we are now running out of time, so let's push forwards. Tied in with the reduced society, let's talk about ethical extremism. So the first time I found myself in Stalker, killing for bread, and trying to work out a way in which I could kill someone for bread without using any bullets, because I was running out of ammunition, and without them actually being able to fight back because I didn't have any bandages. You kind of know you've crossed a threshold, and you're in a really different gameplay space. Now that's a really interesting thing. Games normally put us in a situation where it's kill or be killed. And that's kind of how they justify the kind of the mass kind of slaughtering games. If you're not doing the kind of Deus Ex Dishonored, you can choose to be good or you can choose to be more bad. But actually, if you choose to be good, you're undertaking pretty much exactly the same things, just with a different cutscene. It has no actual ethical meaning, killing or not killing, apart from possibly a couple of kind of like minor branches. That's a very different and kind of not as interesting thing as what goes on in a game like Stalker. Or actually, if you want to go right back, you can look at stuff like in Bungie's original first-person Marathon, where you'd have oxygen-free levels, where you're going to die and you're on a ticking clock, and you basically have to run from oxygen station to oxygen station. Stalker does the same thing. You will die of radiation poisoning, or you'll bleed to death, or you will starve to death, unless you keep moving. So you have to engage in acts. But it's not about throwing zombies at you that will kill you unless you shoot them. It's about saying the entire world will kill you unless you move forwards in the game. It is just a matter of time. Which is taking an arcade model and bolting it onto a narrative game in quite a subtle and quite interesting way. And in a way, it kind of gets you out of the dissonance that you have with characters like Nathan Drake, where quite a few people like Jerome Stout from Stout Games have said there's this really interesting dissonance with Nathan Drake. Funny, charismatic, everyman. We all love Nathan Drake. He's just killed 450 people without breaking a sweat. That's weird. He's a psychopath. He shouldn't be funny and charming. He's nuts. Because he isn't in a situation where it's kind of, you know, it's that kind of kill or be killed throwing at it. Compared to Stalker, where in Stalker you're saying to the player, you don't have to do this. We're not going to force you to kill these people. You're going to die unless you do, but not immediately. So actually what you're doing is murder. Deal with it. That's a much more interesting emotional situation to put someone in. You're not letting them off the hook with a you can smother them and choke them and drop them on the floor nicely and drag them into an air vent. You're killing them, you're going to kill them, and it's murder. And you need to deal with that. Again, it's about kind of changing that kind of emotional significance in the game and saying to the player, we're going to force you to engage with your actions in this, but we're going to place you in a fictional world where this is the reality of every day. This is how you stay alive, because you are dying from the moment that game starts. You're dead. Unless you do these things. That's a much more interesting ethical dimension for me to go into than basically saying, in the next second, a Strog will kill you unless you shotgun it in the face, which is kind of boring, and we don't want bored gamers, because they just end up being Skinner pigeon button clickers. So this idea of an abstract, non-immediate threat, we can use that to drive behavior. We don't have to have immediate threats all the time. We can have a world which is set against the player, as opposed to having specific agents that are set against the player. And that changes the way they do it. Make the player deal with karma. Don't try and represent karma. Players have their own ethical dimensions and stuff. It's really good. I used to teach at university, and we used to look at games in a game design course, and I used to make the students all play Fallout a lot. And we'd always go to them afterwards and say, right, how many people played evil? How many people played good? And in 4 years of running that course, not one student played evil. They all wanted to be good. They wanted to be the hero. And they hated Stalker. because they just thought it was grossly unfair that they were forced to do things they didn't necessarily want to do, which was really weird because they'd have no problem playing stuff like Quake, where they were doing exactly the same thing, but the significance of what they were doing was shifted and changed. So you can use that kind of fiction to change that kind of behavior, and that's really interesting to me. All right, 2 more things and we can wrap up and do some questions. Let's talk about apocalypse porn for a bit, and abandoned building porn and that kind of stuff, which basically is a huge amount. We kind of deal with that of games. Beautiful things still drive gaming. Spectacle still drives gaming to a large extent, particularly with these. And that's a good thing. I love this kind of stuff. I think stuff like Enslaved, Crisis 3, these are really beautiful games. And that kind of spectacle, I think, is a really important part of playing them. It's really important because it's a very, very immediate reaction that you have, a very visceral reaction you have with the game. Spectacle and scale are amazing for just getting you kind of hooked into what's going on. What's really important about these kind of games is that the way they do it is they present things which you know. Again, they take these enormous scales, but actually what's important about your connection with them is the fact that these are vistas and views and kind of like big spectacles, but actually it's about the personal relationship you have with them. A destroyed city, but a city that you recognize which has been destroyed, is more emotionally powerful than a kind of a big alien thing. You can get the spectacle from, say, like a big alien environment, but you don't know it. So you don't have quite the same thing of going, oh, actually, I can understand that people lived there. I can understand that life took place there. And the game doesn't need to do very much to nudge that further in you. But actually, then if you can take that kind of thing and say, and now let's like counterpose that with a very small, intimate detail, an abandoned shoe, a child's teddy bear, it very, very easily and quickly fires up again that emotional commitment to stuff. And while there is definitely a kind of an aestheticization of destruction going on with all of them, there's also about this kind of stillness and this kind of weird intimacy and very, very small, tight, personal kind of thing that's going on, that you kind of get from that combination of saying the beauty of what you're seeing played off against the game trying to constantly nudge you into understanding the awfulness of what happened, again creates a really interesting emotional tension. If you can pull that tension off, you've got the player in a really, really interesting space where they want to look, but they don't want to look, because when they look, they feel, and that's what you're trying to get with them. And we shouldn't underestimate that, the power of using kind of very simple spectacles to achieve that kind of emotional depth. And it is, you know, it is also kind of eye candy, and that's fine. When we made Dear Esther, for example, I mean, I still kind of believe that because it was quite different, a lot of players kind of struggled with the pace of the game. Because the game was so beautiful, because the world which Rob Briscoe built was so beautiful, people would look at it, and they'd look at it for long enough for the game to kind of catch up with them and sucker punch them in the momentum and take them through. Now, if it wasn't as beautiful, I don't think it would have worked as well. We would have lost more people in the first 3 minutes. And that comes down to pure spectacle, of understanding the kind of power of visuals reaching to people at quite an emotional level. And we should kind of like invest in that for sure. Journey's quite an interesting case for this as well. Journey's exceptionally beautiful, and Journey's beauty helps Journey deliver the gameplay experience. Whilst players might still be looking at the beauty, the gameplay experience has got its hooks in. And that's a really powerful thing. But the fundamental thing is that we shouldn't see architecture as functional, we should see architecture as emotional spaces. We can steer and change people's emotional responses by putting them in those spaces. And that play-off between very big and very small is really important. All right, last one. The spiritual dimension. This is Cryostasis, which I love, which is one of the oddest games ever made, and everyone should play. And it's just really, really deeply weird, and gets weirder and weirder and weirder as it goes on. And the reason it can get away with getting weirder and weirder and weirder as it goes on, because it starts off and you think, okay, something's happened at this level, and then you start kind of understanding that actually you have no idea what's happened. The world might have ended, it might not have ended, you might have died, you might not have died, you don't know. But because you go into this space of uncertainty and ambiguity, the game can start doing things all of a sudden. To the point where I can't actually tell you what happens at the end of Cryostasis, but when I first played it, my jaw hit the floor, and I just thought, I cannot actually believe you've just done this. This is insanity. But I loved it, and I lapped it up, because all the way through the game had been training me and saying, where you are, what's going on now at the moment, it's not necessarily real, because the world might have ended. And if the world's ended, who calls the shots? You can take all those imported understandings of physics and society and all that stuff we've been talking about, but actually, now we can start bending those and playing that. And obviously you have kind of situations like in Metro, the ghost sequence, which is, for me, one of the most amazing moments in game narrative and mechanic design, where you simply walk down a tunnel and see ghosts and echoes of a society which has been there. And even though you kind of take monsters and mutants on the chin, because we've seen them all a million times, but seeing kind of groups of people just muttering and going about their business is really creepy and eerie, because it doesn't feel like it should belong in a game, because there's no actual kind of like kind of feedback response to it. There's no kind of achievement, nothing you can do particularly. It's just there, but it kind of feels wrong. But what it really does, I think, particularly with Metro, is it makes it very, very poignant. That you kind of go, I'm seeing ghosts, I'm seeing people, I can't do anything, I can't save them, I can't resolve this, I just have to kind of watch these things play out in a way which is quite sort of weirdly upsetting in some places. Well, I'm quite soft about shooters, which is a very weird thing to say. But it's really hard emotion to create that idea of poignancy. And I think the reason they can get away with it is because they do this idea of going, if the world's ended, we can start reinventing those rules. We've given you a bunch of rules, we've let you import your understandings of the world, we've played with those a little bit, but actually, we can kind of do what we want. And that's a really, again, really interesting case of where the fiction justifies a load of mechanic design that you can start playing with the player however you want. It would be really weird living through the end of the world. Reality's faltering, you can change the rules, that's quite important, and that gives you a lot of freedom as a designer. So, I just want to end by reading a short kind of treatment of, that kind of ties all of those things together, really, and sort of suggests a game experience that could be had if we played with all those, that hopefully will provide some kind of way of illustrating that kind of stuff. So, just bear with me and imagine this if you can. We're alone for long periods of time. The loneliness is punctuated at irregular intervals by encounters which are characterized by high levels of tension and anxiety, as we can't predict generic behavior or levels of threat. We end up killing allies because we're afraid they want our equipment. We feel saddened when we kill even those who are trying to kill us, because they're so few, and we feel pretty lonely, and we're forced back to isolation again. We pass through a settlement. We track down a thief who'd escaped with a blanket, and the settlement never asks what happened to him. Instead, we get water for return. They let us stay for a while, and an old man sings a song we half remember. It's the only time in the entire game we hear music. They can't offer anything else, so we move on and never see them again. We used a plastic bottle from the water they gave us, together with duct tape and a cigarette lighter that we traded for an ammunition clip, to fashion a flamethrower with some decanted white spirits we loot from the body of a man who'd been drinking it because he ran out of water. We used a flamethrower to avoid being eaten by rats. We see ghosts flitting around the summits of the skyscrapers, and we trick an old couple into following us into a basement, using them to satisfy the hunger of the ghouls who live there. We can run faster than they can. All we want to do is go home. There are no heroics anymore. Even the simplest act is fraught and lengthy. Our reward for scaling a building is a rotten can of beans, but we're so pathetically grateful because it keeps us alive for another gameplay hour. On a different occasion, we sneak through the dark and steal a gas mask from someone. They're dead without it. We don't need to fire a shot. We feel a weird mix of elation and guilt. Later, at the game's climax, we offer our shoes to a child so they can cross some broken glass without risking an infected cut. We spent 2 gameplay hours trying to get the shoes. A pair of shoes meant more to us than all the ammo the game had to offer, and when we gave them to the kid in that final moment, we felt like we'd saved the world. And after all of that, we get home. It's a burnt-out wreck. No one's there. Everyone's gone. But it doesn't matter. We've made it home, and we've retained what humanity and dignity we could along the way. We're getting there. We're actually really close to that kind of experience, which feels much more like a book experience or a movie experience. When you start putting all these pieces together from these games, you start getting a sense that actually we are chasing that thing down, that really elusive thing where we're not offering traditional rewards, we're not offering traditional relationships between mechanics and fiction, but we are kind of actually optimizing that relationship and saying we can use the world which we create to make that contract with the player really tight and really honed, and we should be looking for every opportunity to do that. And sure, it's not fun in the traditional sense, but some days are Mario days and some days are not Mario days, and more people are looking at producing darker fictions and saying there is an entertainment in a darker fiction. We do want to play out those rules. We do want to try and understand how we might operate, how we might think, how we might relate to those kind of situations. And what's really powerful about the post-apocalyptic setting is that it says this is all about how you might relate. This is not about the global, this is not about the epic, this is about individual people dealing with tiny local events and just trying to make their way through for another half an hour or so. So that's it really. I'm going to leave you there. Can hopefully have a bit of time to take some questions, and hopefully some of that's been useful. Thank you. So, if anyone has any questions at all. Yep.
Hi, so great talk, by the way. One of the things that have always been bugging me in a post-apocalyptic world, it's something that's very morbid. It's very real. It makes people depressive but hopeful at the same time. These kind of situations inspire very dramatic and drastic situations, and most of the time you're caught in a situation of doing something that you would never even want to consider or think about doing it for your own survival. Where do you stand on the perspective of things like you have to probably kill someone to get a bullet, but what about when you have to actually hurt a woman or a child or an animal or an indefenseless human being that nowadays in society is such an extremely controversial thing? You wouldn't ever dare to do something like that. How would you stand on that? It's such a powerful thing, but such a controversial thing at the same time.
I think so it's about the kind of this thing of ethics of making people commit acts that they wouldn't normally commit. I think the danger with games is letting players off the hook doing that, because actually we commit kind of appalling acts left, right, and centre, and we kind of don't even notice that we're doing it. And I think generally it becomes from this kind of thing of the immediacy of kill or be killed. You have to do this now, or the game finishes, or you have to reload. And I think we've moved a little bit getting around that from having stuff like karma bars, saying, well, we'll represent to you how good or evil you're being, and then you can do that. And I really hate karma bars, because I think you can kind of go, oh, I am 35% evil. And if I, do this, then I'm 37% evil. And it's just ridiculous. You don't really think like that. I think giving the player time and space to think about what they're doing and consider what they're doing, and not presenting it as a kind of an immediate kill or be killed, actually means that you are in a kind of a weird situation. You cannot, if you're going to ask the player to do things which are socially reprehensible, you have to deal with the fact that you are enabling people to undertake and play out that act. And you've just got to deal with that as a developer and make the decision of whether you feel ethically comfortable in letting a player commit an act which you feel is ethically or immorally horrendous. And you have to be able to justify why you're doing that. And I think what we're kind of moving towards more as developers, and what you see in these games more, is less the assumption that it's just pure fantasy. And I don't kind of buy particularly the kind of stuff about this has bad kind of social kind of like outcomes if you allow people to commit violent acts and stuff like that. But I think what you should do is say, am I happy with asking the player to do this? And can I accept the fact that some players will do this just because they just want to play it out, or they'll have no connection to it? I think what we're trying to do is get players to consider their actions. And I think for a player to consider their actions, you have to ramp back the immediate kind of like, you have to respond, you have to respond, you have to respond. So you have to give them time to think about what they're doing and know that you feel comfortable with it as a developer, I guess.
Cool, thanks a lot.
Hi, so that was a really good talk. One of the things I've noticed in a lot of post-apocalyptic games is that the world is very depressing, obviously, and everything's kind of gone to crap. But there's still that notion of humor, and there's still that like very weirdly comic sense to it. And I was wondering if you could comment maybe slightly on that.
Yes, the questions about kind of humor, the dark humor of the end of the world. I think it's one of those things which defining makes us human, though, isn't it? It's kind of like laughing in the face of catastrophe. And I think what's really is good that is kind of, you find that kind of inevitability in there. That kind of, again, it's that thing of saying this is, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to use the big to relate to the small. We're trying to make players feel humanly connected to what's going on around them. And I think that kind of humor, yeah, it's one of the most things which is most humanizing is kind of humor. It's also one of the hardest things to pull off as a game writer, I think. It's so hard to kind of get that stuff in there. So I was playing Crisis 3 the other day, and what really surprised me and broadsided me about Crisis 2 is I really emotionally engaged with the kind of the key NPC, Psycho, who is now, he's been, for the, you're all in these alien kind of nanosuits, and he's been cut out of his, and he's got old, and he's creaky, and he puffs after you and can't climb trees and can't kick doors down and stuff like that. And it's kind of, it starts you off thinking it's kind of funny, because he's up at the door and he's going, trying to kick it open. Then you come along with your alien nanosuit and rip the door off and go, oh, let me, and it's kind of ha-ha. But then you kind of go, it's not ha-ha, actually, it's really sad. But it kind of is and it kind of isn't. And I was like, I'm playing Crisis and I'm having an emotional reaction. Wow, that's, it's kind of cool. Yeah, I think it's really hard, but if you can do it, I think it's small moments of human intimacy, and I think humor is one of the most powerful and one of the most hard to pull off. And it's the usual thing. The more powerful it is, the harder it is to pull off, and that's why you've got to aim for those big targets and try and actually do it. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great talk. Thanks a lot. I was writing a little bit recently and talking with someone about it that surrounded like a very difficult moral choice in the game, and the person said, well, this doesn't sound very fun. And I said, I don't really know that it's supposed to be fun. I just wanted to get your comments on this sort of balancing evoking an emotion in the player versus like having fun, which may be an awkward situation or, for the player.
So my take on fun is that games are the only medium where we obsess about whether something's fun or not. And I think pretty much every other medium, you kind of go, well, Hamlet's not fun, and stopped it being, lasting for 100 years. Plenty of films are really bleak and dark. Plenty of books are really bleak and dark. You have to separate fun from engagement. And if you can't separate fun from engagement, you're never going to make a sophisticated media experience, because it's just crazy. It's like saying, you can kind of hear it. I mean, you see it in films, you sit there and you're watching a film and it's really, really great, and you go, and at this point the producer stepped in with the test audience, and the end suddenly is happy. And you kind of go, how did that come from? And I think you have to kind of trust that people want to experience all levels of human reaction to situations, which is, in most media is going right back to kind of cave paintings, is an exploration of what it means to be human in the world. And being human in the world is not limited to being fun. So the idea that actually you can't engage with stuff unless it's fun is just ludicrous, really. So, yeah. I think it's just a hang-up we have to get over. And it's not saying games all have to be dark. Now, some games have to be fun. It's great. I love playing fun games, but you don't have to do it at all. Yeah, and people will take it. I think we're getting to a point where we're actually finally kind of the kind of turning the corner of going, players will take stuff. They're really happy for you to play around. They're really happy to be messed with. They're really happy for you to force them into different situations. And actually, the thing which I think is most important for us to kind of get head around is they're really happy to think. They want to think. They want to feel. They don't just want to be sort of like punched in the face repeatedly. So I think we're heading in the right direction, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
I think we have time for like one more question.
Yeah, you spoke a little bit about the contradiction of like the macho fantasy. I was wondering if you had any insights about just the alone fantasy of the post-apocalyptic universe.
Sorry, I do mean the sort of the loner fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah, I think part of the interest of this kind of scenario is, again, it comes down to this thing of the what if it was me? And I think there's quite a deep-rooted kind of anxiety, probably, he said without a psychology degree, in being human about what if I was alone? What would that feel like? We are incredibly social creatures. It's like the kind of, and it's such an extreme situation to think yourself into. And I think any kind of post-apocalyptic scenario, I think one of the reasons why those kind of fictions are popular is because they enable us to try and get a window of understanding on what that might feel like. I think the traditional model, particularly of, say, shooters, is that you are alone because you are a god, and you become increasingly more godlike and you move away. And actually, when you look at kind of FPS avatars, a lot of effort is invested to separate them from humanity to enable that transition to happen. So you might be alone, but you're all powerful. And I think it kind of flips in the other direction, where actually people are kind of still going with that kind of apocalyptic stuff. There is a degree of fantasy about it, but I think it's maybe tied into something that's even a little bit deeper than that, of going, well, what if I was alone? And I think that's a really much more interesting emotional space to explore, of going, well, what if you were alone and powerless? What if actually you couldn't do anything? What if you do that? I think, and we need to use fiction to explore those types of things. I think it's, again, like I've got a kid and seeing him start to sort of ask those questions and try and understand, well, what does it mean when I'm the adult and I have to take responsibility for my actions? We need media to explore those aspects of being human that we can't explore ourselves in our daily lives. And I think it's very tied into that, if that answers the question. I think we're out of time. Oh, yeah, we're good? We're good for, yeah. Okay.
Thanks. If you look at a world like John Carpenter's Escape from New York City, where you kind of have a tiny apocalyptic piece in a bigger world that has not ended, how does that change? How will you work with that setting? What would be different from what you just described?
Okay, so the question is about having kind of like a kind of a micro-apocalypse within a world which hasn't kind of changed, which is the kind of like, say like Resident Evil 4 kind of presents that as like this village is screwed and it's weird, but the rest of the world is basically okay. I don't think there's anything, I think you can still apply an awful lot of those techniques. I think you can still talk about refocusing the player on small actions, small objects. You can still talk about increasing isolation and vacuum to artificially boost significance and that kind of stuff. I think what the kind of, for me, the kind of underlying thing which is in there, in a lot of these types of fictions, is about saying, it's gone. You can't walk outside it. You can't, if you travel far enough, you won't reach the edge of this. So you have to look to now. You have to look to what's going on. But you don't achieve that having to look to now and having to look to the immediate through throwing things at the player. You do it through saying you haven't got anything else. It's literally, you know, it's a wasteland out there. You've only got what's happening right now to you in this space. So I think it's a conceptually different framework, but I think the kind of the tools which are being used can still be applied of saying this is, you know, don't let the player accumulate too much. Make every individual instance mean more. Look for the emotional connection with everything that happens rather than the functional connection. Use the fiction to justify the acts that the player has. Give them time to space to think and feel about what they're doing. And don't let them off the hook and don't make them earn their rewards. And it is kind of in a weird kind of way. It's going back to kind of like old-fashioned arcade game design, you know. Make them earn it. But we want them to emotionally earn it as opposed to kind of point-based earn it, I guess. So it maps across, I think, but that changes, that idea that there is no, this is it, what you have right now, that's all you've got. Which, of course, is amazingly powerful for a game world design because you don't actually want the player to consider anything other than what you've given them. So,
Right, thanks.
Cool. Thank you all very much for coming.